Well, hello, hello, hello. This is Exodus Explained. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Bible and the Pentateuch. Exodus builds on the narrative of creation, human sin, divine punishment and renewal, the call of Abraham to bless the world, the struggles of Isaac and then Jacob to carry out God's call, the sins with Joseph taking his father's family into Egypt to avoid the harsh sufferings of famine. Exodus takes up the story of the children of Jacob in Egypt, now under control of a new pharaoh and seen as feared foreigners instead of welcome deliverers from famine. The Exodus marks the real beginning of the history of Israel as a people. Before this one experience of God's deliverance from slavery, whatever traditions there were centered on individual clans and persons. From now on, every text speaks of a nation unified by faithfulness to God, who chooses them for a special role. There now become two focal points: a single God and a single people bound together for better or for worse. The historical event itself, no matter how everyday and ordinary it might seem in our times, because we're used to world wars and fearful of universal atomic destruction, was built up and described with all the images of divine power and miracle significant to the ancient people. The book of Exodus is about a daring escape. Even the meaning of the word Exodus implies a quick exit. Exodus describes these two main events: Israel's departure from Egypt, aka the rescue, and Israel's newly established alliance with God, aka relationship. Yet we cannot separate the escape from Egypt from what follows in the desert and in the conquest. This divine act of liberation was motive enough for a group of people to pledge itself to this God in a binding covenant. The Exodus miracle had proven the love and power of Yahweh and shown that he was worth trusting. So chapter 1, Israel became slave laborers in Egypt. Then God delivered baby Moses from the danger, and he grew up in the Pharaoh's court as the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. Then the story jumps to show Moses seeing some Israelites being treated wrong, and then he killed an Egyptian. Thus he fled and met a woman and married her. Then God talked to Moses through a burning bush and sent him back to save the people. See, with Aaron, Moses' brother, they came to a stubborn Pharaoh, who of course refused to free the people. God brought forth plagues upon Egypt. The 10 plagues became the setting of Israel's central religious celebration, that of the Passover and the unleavened bread, in which Israel reenacted the Exodus from Egypt and rejoiced at God's supreme act of salvation for his people in chapters 5 through 13. Chapter 14, of course, is the famous escape, the parting of the sea. They celebrated the deliverance in song and dance in chapter 15, verse 1 through 21, but the wandering proved to be too hard. The Israelites then cried for the good old days in Egypt again. God supplied them with food and drink after the defeat of the Amalekites in chapter 15, verse 22, all the way through chapter 17, verse 15. Then the 10 Commandments in chapter 19 through 23. Then there was a covenant in a mysterious ceremony in chapter 24. Moses went to the top of the mountain to receive the remainder of God's instructions, especially instructions for building the sacred place of worship, the tabernacle, in chapter 24 through chapter 31. But impatient Israel got Aaron to build an object of worship they could see, so they made a golden calf. The people began to worship it, and this of course angered God, who sent Moses back to them. Moses prayed for them and saw the unfaithfulness again, and upon this he threw the tablets down, breaking them. God punished them, but did not destroy them. God continued to show his presence in the tent of meeting and in letting his glory pass by Moses in chapter 32 and chapter 33. God then gave Moses the law on 2 new tablets and renewed the covenant. Such intense talks with God had a radiant glow on Moses' face in chapter 34. Moses then led Israel to celebrate the Sabbath and to build the tabernacle in chapter 35 through 39. Moses set up the tabernacle and established worship in it. God blessed the actions with his holy, glorious presence in chapter 40. This provided the sign for Israel's future journeys, following God's cloud and fire. In Exodus, Israel learned the basic nature of God and his salvation. They also learned the nature of sin, the characteristics of God's leader, Moses, the components of worship, and the meaning of salvation. In Exodus, Israel learned the identity of the people of God. God is the ruler of the world, able to act for his people even on the home territory of the world's most powerful political and military force. God chooses to act for the people he elects. God knows the situation of his people even when another nation has forced them into slavery. Salvation, power, and concern was not all God revealed of himself. He also showed a holy nature in that special preparations were made to enter his presence. The book of Exodus describes Israel's travels under the direction of God from Egypt through the desert to the foot mount of Sinai. So the book has a geographical arrangement. 1. Israel in Egypt in chapter 1 through chapter 12 verse 36. 2. Israel in the desert in chapter 12 verse 37 through chapter 18 verse 27. And 3. Israel at Mount Sinai in chapter 19 through 40. The birth of Moses is God's answer to this terrible predicament. The Exodus may be dated around 1446 or 1275 BC. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 dates the Exodus 480 years before Solomon built the temple in 966 BC. The book of Exodus and the events it describes are of paramount importance in the Christian theology. God sovereignly redeemed his people from a life of bondage and tied himself to them in a covenant relationship. This role of God became central for the rest of the Old Testament. Moses and God were on a collision course. The Lord was determined to save the Israelites. The famous call of Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3 and chapter 4 is where they collide. In Exodus chapter 3 verse 2, Moses' attention was caught by the bush as it burned without being consumed. When he turned aside to see it, the Lord spoke to him, gave him instructions. It no matter any way people put is an act of God. Some try to say that the colors had fiery colors in the leaves, or that the leaves reflected the sunlight. But the world always tries to debunk God. Next, God would do something that only God could do, the 10 plagues. The first plague was the plague of blood in Exodus chapter 7, verse 14 through 24. The second plague was the plague of frogs in Exodus chapter 8, verse 1 through 15. The third plague was the plague of gnats in Exodus 8, verse 16 through 19. The fourth was the plague of flies, Exodus chapter 8, verse 20 through 32. The fifth was the plague on livestock, Exodus 9, verse 1 through 7. Sixth was the plague of boils in Exodus chapter 9, verse 8 through 12. 7 was the plague of hail, Exodus chapter 9, verse 13 through 35. Eighth was the plague of locusts in Exodus 10, verse 1 through 20. The ninth plague was the plague of darkness in Exodus 10, verse 21 through 29. The 10th plague was the plague of the firstborn in Exodus chapter 11, Exodus chapter 12, verse 1 through 30. God had the Israelites paint blood on the doorpost to protect them. See, disease interpreted as divine judgment. Translation of several Hebrew words, the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus, were the mighty work of God that gained Israel's release and demonstrated God's sovereignty and were called plagues. In Exodus chapter 9, verse 14, and Exodus 11, verse 1. But they were also called signs in Exodus chapter 7, verse 13. And they were called wonders in Exodus chapter 7, verse 3, and Exodus chapter 11, verse 9. They showed God of Moses was sovereign over the lowercase g gods of Egypt, including Pharaoh, who was considered a god by the Egyptians. See, the primary reference to the plagues in the Bible in the book of Exodus, chapter 7, all the way through chapter 13, verse 15, we can also see these in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 34, chapter 7, verse 19, chapter 11, verse 3, Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 20. Psalm 78 and 105 contain detailed accounts of the plagues, but neither includes all 10. Paul used the plagues to stress the sovereignty of God in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in Romans chapter 9, verse 17 through 18. The plagues in Revelation reflect the old in Revelation 8 and Revelation 16. The plagues result in Israel's freedom. However, the central purpose was the revelation of God. The 10 plagues were intended not only to force the Egyptians into compliance, but also to teach both the Egyptians and the Israelites about the sovereign character of God of Israel. The Egyptians believed their God, King Pharaoh, was responsible for maintaining life, giving the Nile River and the sun to rise daily. Next, we're going to talk about the pillar of cloud and fire. This is visual evidence that God's presence with Israel during the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. In Exodus 14, verse 24, Exodus 33, verse 9 through 10, you also find it in Numbers chapter 12, verse 5, Deuteronomy 31, verse 15. As a sign of God's presence, the pillar of cloud and fire was associated with divine actions. Salvation in Exodus 14, verse 19 through 20. Revelation in Exodus 33, verse 9 through 10. We also find that in Psalm 99, verse 7. But it was also as judgment in Numbers 12, verse 5. Commissioning during Deuteronomy 31, verse 15. Nehemiah used the pillars as a sign God's faithfulness in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 12 and verse 19. Psalm 99, verse 7 reflects an otherwise unknown tradition that the pillar abided with Israel until the time of Samuel. Jesus' self-presentation as the incarnated light of the world in John 8:12 recalls the guiding light of the wilderness wanderings. See, in Jesus' day, the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles in John 7:2 included the lighting of the great golden lamps in the temple court as a reminder of the pillar of fire and cloud. Jesus, as the living light, challenged people to follow him. See, the theme of the first book, or the first section of this book, is deliverance in chapter 1 through chapter 18 in Exodus. The people of God were languishing under the heavy bondage of the Egyptians. They had no leadership and no hope of escape, but God was moved by the cries of his people and his early commitment to the patriarchs. See, in an act of grace, he delivered his people by providing the necessary human leader, Moses. Through dramatic plagues, God demonstrated his sovereign control of nature and broke the Egyptian hold on Israel, freeing the nation to escape. The spectacular miracle of the Sea of Reeds was the ultimate act of deliverance in chapter 14 and 15. The helpless Israelites were now free. Though no merit of their own, the Lord had become their salvation in Exodus 15, verse 2. Now, the theme of the second section of Exodus, the rest of the chapters, is 19 through 40. This covenant was going to be different, the 10 Commandments. You find them in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 through 17. It says, "And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make any graven images or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hated me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, though nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. The 10 Commandments and the other commandments of chapters 21 through 23 were a natural part of the relationship between God and the Israelites. The terms of the covenant were a result of God's grace and love for his people. He issued his laws for the nations after he had redeemed his people and established his bond of intimate relationship with them. See, the law served as a seal on that relationship. Throughout the Old Testament, the law is a positive expression of God's will for his people. The first 4 are related to relationship with God. The next 6 are to do with human relationships. The 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1 through 17, the Bible actually calls them words in Deuteronomy 10:4, because they are principles for living more than laws. The rest of the law is based on them in chapter 21 through 23, are called the Book of the Covenant in Exodus 24, verse 7. After God gave the law to Israel, Moses led the nation in a solemn and sacred covenant ceremony binding God and nation together in Exodus chapter 24, verse 3 through 8. Moses sprinkled sacrificial blood on the altar which represented God in verse 6. Then he reads the book of the covenant to the people and sprinkled blood on them as well in verse 7 through 8. Moses called this blood the blood of the covenant. Remember, in Matthew 26, verse 28, Jesus says, "For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remissions of sin." See, Exodus 25, the purpose of the desert tabernacle was clear from the beginning. It was not like the churches we have today, some huge building. It was God's way of living in the midst of his people. This large tent, however, would now be God's dwelling place. The glory of his presence, which had provided both protection and comfort, would now reside in the center of the Israelite camp. The word tabernacle itself means dwelling place. The tabernacle section of the book uses repetition. 7 chapters, chapter 25 through 31, give detailed instructions for building the tabernacle with all of its furnishings. In the Old Testament, there are 3 tabernacles mentioned. One is after the golden calf. The provisional tabernacle was established outside the camp, called the tent of meeting, in Exodus 33, verse 7. The second was the Sinaitic tabernacle, it was built in accordance with the directions given to Moses by God in Exodus 25 through Exodus 40. The third was the Davidic tabernacle in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 17. Then there's 5 chapters. Exodus 35 through 39 relate how Moses and the Israelites obeyed in every detail. What comes between the 2 sections of the tabernacle, however, is an example of stark disobedience in chapter 32 through 34. The children of Israel created the golden calf, their idol. Chapter 40 is the triumphant climax to the book of Exodus. The reoccurring phrase makes the point. Moses and the Israelites performed the task of building God's tabernacle just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now, in conclusion, the deliverance and the covenant, these are the 2 main themes of Exodus. Chapters 1 through 18 being the deliverance and chapters 19 through 40 being the covenant. Moreover, an emphasis on the presence of God runs throughout the whole book, though. The purpose of the Exodus from Egypt and the covenant on the mountain with the 10 Commandments, with its laws and the tabernacle, can be summarized in this way. God was preparing Israel for his arrival in their midst. Israel's escape from slavery in Egypt and journey towards the promised land under Moses, the most important event in the Old Testament is Israel's Exodus. The Bible stresses that the Exodus was the work of God. God brought forth the plagues on Egypt. The miracle at the sea was never to be treated as merely a natural event. The book of Exodus has been one of the most read books and even played out through movies and plays. May God bless you all, and I hope you really enjoyed this. Like this, share it on some social media. If you're a new subscriber, let's fellowship together like the book of Acts and grow in God's word daily together. I love you all, and until we meet again, I'll be working on the book of Leviticus explained.